This is Crime Traveler from Murdermind, delving into the cold archives of history's most disturbing cases. Here, every location guards a dark truth, and every shadow tells a story. The date is February 24th, 1986, in Los Angeles, California. Not far from this very spot, a crisp, clear morning descends upon the San Fernando Valley. Sherri Rasmussen, a dedicated 29-year-old nursing director, fails to report for her shift at Glendale Adventist Medical Center. This was a stark anomaly for a woman whose colleagues knew her for impeccable reliability. Later that afternoon, her husband, John Ruetten, returned to their condo on Balboa Boulevard to discover a scene of utter devastation. The interior was a landscape of violence: shattered glass, a ransacked living room, and Sherri's body on the floor, her features nearly obliterated. She had been brutally beaten and shot 3 times. The scene was saturated with blood. Near her body lay the fragments of a broken vase, and, most disturbingly, a bite mark was indented on her forearm. John Ruetten collapsed next to the woman he had married just 3 months prior. His wife was gone. Investigators would soon paint a portrait of Sherri as a vibrant soul, a person who radiated energy. At only 29, she was a director of nursing, brilliant, highly respected, and ambitious. Her parents, Nels and Loretta Rasmussen, would later recall her as the kind of daughter any parent would be proud of. She had recently married John, a promising young engineer at a computer company. They had just purchased the condo together. It was meant to be the start of a new life, a promising new chapter. Instead, it became a crime scene. The initial assessment pointed towards a burglary that had spiraled into violence. The shattered sliding glass doors suggested a forced entry. The living room was in chaos. A VCR and stereo equipment were stacked by the door, as if ready for removal. Missing from the scene were Sherri's purse and her car, a BMW. In homicides where a homeowner interrupts a burglary, it's not uncommon for the perpetrator to panic, leading to a fatal confrontation. Based on the initial evidence, the detectives' theory of a botched burglary was entirely plausible. Their working hypothesis suggested the involvement of at least 2 assailants. They believed the intruders broke in, were surprised by Sherri's unexpected presence, and she fought for her life. In the ensuing struggle, she was killed. The perpetrators then fled, one taking their own vehicle, the other escaping in Sherri's BMW. Yet, something about the scene felt discordant, almost staged. Sherri's jewelry box remained untouched. A more profound question lingered. Why bring a firearm to a simple burglary? In an investigator's experience, a crime scene is defined as much by what is left behind as by what is taken. The items ignored can often be the most revealing clue. And the level of violence inflicted upon Sherri felt excessive, personal. The subsequent autopsy confirmed that Sherri had been locked in a ferocious battle with her attacker. Beyond the physical struggle, there were 3 close-range gunshot wounds to her chest from a .38 caliber weapon. This was no swift, opportunistic crime. This was an act of pure rage. The sheer brutality directed at Sherri Rasmussen signaled that this attack was deeply personal. This was not a burglary. Valuables like jewelry were left at the scene. Furthermore, by all accounts, electronic equipment was piled near the exit but never taken. The discovery of Sherri's purse nearby and her BMW abandoned not far away with the keys still inside further dismantled the theory. It seemed the only thing the intruders had intended to steal was Sherri's life. But the botched burglary theory gained unexpected traction. Shortly after the murder, police were alerted to a separate burglary just a few blocks from the Rasmussen residence. In that incident, a woman came home to find 2 men ransacking her apartment. As they escaped, one of the perpetrators aimed a handgun at her. The proximity and similar method led detectives to consider a link. These could be Sherri's killers. The witness provided a description of 2 Hispanic males. Composite sketches were created and distributed throughout the community, but the leads went cold. No arrests followed. For Sherri's family, the theory of a random burglary gone wrong never resonated as truth. They urged police to look into a female nurse with whom Sherri had professional conflicts. According to Sherri, this colleague had been harassing her over a lost promotion at the hospital. Sherri's father also informed detectives about another woman, a persistent and unsettling presence in his daughter's life, who had allegedly followed her and even confronted her at home and at her workplace. Nels Rasmussen identified this woman as John Ruetten's ex-girlfriend, though he couldn't recall her name. Nels was adamant that his daughter had expressed a genuine fear for her own safety. Ultimately, investigators dismissed both women as persons of interest in the murder. In law enforcement, there is a phenomenon known as tunnel vision, where investigators lock onto a single theory or motive, and in doing so, they unconsciously filter out all contradictory evidence. To properly resolve a homicide, an open mind is paramount. Every possibility must be considered. To fixate on one path, one hypothesis, one interpretation of the evidence is not just a mistake, it's a danger. It was in these gaps that evidence vanished, opportunities were lost, and potential suspects slipped through the cracks. So, investigators proceeded by the book. They dusted the scene for prints, gathered spent bullet casings, and carefully swabbed the bite impression left on Sherri's arm. It was a piece of evidence whose immense significance would lie dormant for decades. In 1986, the forensic application of DNA was still in its primitive stages. At the time, they were limited to basic blood typing. Only with the modern evolution of forensic science and DNA technology would it become a tool to actually identify murderers. Every investigative path they followed turned into a dead end. Within a matter of months, the investigation stalled, officially becoming a cold case. Years ticked by, and the file was passed between different generations of investigators. Certain elements of the crime scene defied logic. Why would a burglar neatly stack stolen electronics by the door only to abandon them? The scene felt staged, hinting at an intruder who knew her, someone intimately familiar with the layout of her home. It pointed to a person she felt safe enough with to open the door. For more than 20 years, the case file gathered dust in a cold case locker. The evidence, the blood samples, the fingerprints, and the swab from that bite mark remained preserved, but untouched. Then, in 2004, the LAPD Cold Case Unit initiated a review of old homicide files. The Rasmussen case was pulled from the archives. By then, DNA testing had evolved dramatically since 1986, enough to warrant re-examining that one small piece of evidence, the swab from the bite mark. When the DNA lab analyzed the sample, the working theory was that they would find a male profile, perhaps belonging to one of the suspected burglars. Instead, the results were stunning. The DNA profile that came back belonged to a woman. One might expect such a revelation to fundamentally alter the direction of the investigation, but it did not. Investigators clung to the theory that the murder was a burglary gone wrong, simply amending it to include a male and a female suspect. They pursued this new angle, but it yielded nothing. Once again, the case went cold. In 2009, 23 years after Sherri's murder, a detective was taking one final look at the case file before consigning it to the police archives. He was convinced that the physical evidence from the crime scene, especially that female DNA profile, painted an entirely different narrative of what had occurred. It became clear that murder was the primary motive. This single insight changed everything, and the burglary theory collapsed overnight. This was no random home invasion. This was personal. As homicide investigators, the protocol is to start with the victim, to build a victimology, examining who was in their inner circle, and then working outward from there. Focusing first on the victim's life and relationships is Homicide 101. Had that fundamental step been taken in 1986, this case might have been solved much sooner. They turned their attention to Sherri's family and friends, all of whom voluntarily provided DNA samples for comparison. Each one was quickly excluded. The focus then shifted to a former co-worker who had reportedly harassed Sherri. Detectives managed to secure a DNA sample from this individual, but the test results confirmed she was not the killer. At last, only one person of interest remained, someone whose name had been in the file from the very beginning. She was a figure mentioned by Sherri's own father, yet her potential involvement had been dismissed for decades. In the time leading up to the murder in 1986, Sherri had confided in friends about a deeply unsettling encounter. A woman had unexpectedly appeared at her workplace, identifying herself as an ex-girlfriend of her husband, John Ruetten. This woman had confronted Sherri, accusing her of stealing John, and had even tailed her back to her home. But Sherri's father had never known the woman's name. Detectives reached out to John Ruetten about this mysterious ex-girlfriend, and it was then that they finally learned her identity, Stephanie Lazarus. But this discovery came with another, more shocking revelation. Stephanie Lazarus was a decorated, veteran detective with the Los Angeles Police Department. It emerged that she had been in a relationship with John years before his marriage to Sherri, an attachment she had apparently never severed. Could a police detective be Sherri Rasmussen's killer? In a career investigating homicides, A police officer had never been the prime suspect. And the fact that Stephanie Lazarus was one of their own added a layer of profound complexity. This was undoubtedly one of the most challenging investigations these detectives would ever face. But for any committed investigator, the identity of the suspect, even if it's a fellow officer, is irrelevant. The focus remains singular: to secure justice for the victim. In 2009, the LAPD's Elite Robbery Homicide Division launched a covert operation. Undercover officers tailed Lazarus to a Costco in Simi Valley, where they retrieved a cup she had discarded at a food court table. The crime lab's analysis delivered the confirmation they needed. Her DNA was an identical match to the sample left on Sherri's body. Days later, Stephanie Lazarus was placed under arrest inside LAPD headquarters. Her Miranda rights were read to her in the very building where she had built her career. The news sent shockwaves through the department. When the trial began, the prosecution methodically laid out their timeline of events. Consumed by an obsession with John, Lazarus confronted Sherri alone in her condominium, where a brutal and violent struggle for survival ensued. Sherri fought back fiercely, but she was bludgeoned and ultimately shot with what prosecutors theorized was Lazarus's own department-issued firearm. The bullets recovered were .3 to .8 caliber, the standard issue ammunition for LAPD officers back in 1986. And in a move that seemed almost too calculated, Lazarus reported her service weapon stolen shortly after the homicide. The scene had been meticulously staged to mimic a burglary, a deception that buried the case in cold files for 23 years. In 2012, a jury found Stephanie Lazarus guilty of first-degree murder, and she received a sentence of 27 years to life in prison. Among the endless cases of murder driven by rage, passion, or greed, this one stands apart. A sworn officer of the law murdered an innocent woman, then silently watched for decades as her own colleagues pursued phantoms. The case is a chilling reminder that the most convincing misdirection isn't accidental. It's crafted by someone with intimate knowledge of how investigations work, and it proves that no matter how much time passes, the truth rarely stays silent forever. It simply waits for the right detective and the right DNA analysis to drag it back into the light. This is Vince Velasquez, and this has been the Murdermind Crime Traveler. Subscribe to Murdermind to ensure you never miss a case, and explore our other files for an inside look at more homicide investigations. Until then, keep your mind on murder.